Hey guys, how's it going? I hope you're doing well. So today we're gonna be making a lipless crankbait, and this is kind of more of a musky size, if you will. And the wood that I'm gonna be using for this one is rather special. And yeah, it actually has some special features inside of it too, which I haven't tried before. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like the video if you did, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. If you want, you also can support me on Patreon nowadays, but that's optional. Anyways, let's just jump right into it, and I'm going to be showing you how to make this pretty awesome looking lipless crankbait. Alright, I'm going to start the project by cutting an appropriate piece from this lacewood board. This is also known as leopard wood, and if you don't know, this is a fairly dense and heavy wood, meaning that it's not the easiest to work with, but it does have a really awesome looking pattern to it, and I wanted to use this for a lure for the longest time now. The idea that I have for my lipless crankbait is that I would have internal chambers that would house a weight system and also a rattle chamber, which is something that I haven't done before. And yeah, I'm just going to have to split this piece of lacewood or leopard wood, whatever you want to call it, into two halves to do that. Next I will be smoothing the surfaces that will be glued together later on with my belt sander. Now that I have the pieces of lacewood flattened out nicely, I'm just going to actually glue them together, so when I will go to the bandsaw and cut the shape out, I will get two identical pieces. Now that I have the overall shape traced on the piece of lacewood, I'm just going to cut it out with my bandsaw. Once I had cut the overall shape out with my bandsaw, I headed to the disc sander and smoothed everything out there. At this point the glue hadn't dried yet, so it's pretty easy to just knock the two pieces off from each other. So the next thing I'm going to do with the build is I'm going to make a template for those internal cavities that I will be putting on the weight and also the rattle chamber. And next, unsurprisingly, I'm just going to use the template to mark out on the two pieces where I need to drill and chisel out the cavity. Next I'm going to head to the drill press, and I'm going to just take out excess material here so that I don't have that much removal to do later on when I actually start working on this with a chisel. Prior to starting this project, I already knew that I wanted to do things a little bit differently on this one and kind of show you guys an alternative way of doing things. There's not just one way of going about things, you just have to be a little bit creative sometimes. So, what I have here is a piece of brass, which is an actual old door hinge that I'm going to be cutting into size and using as weight. So if you remember, I mentioned earlier that I'm going to be putting a rattle chamber inside the lure. And I actually don't have any kind of rattle chambers, so I have to make it myself. So I decided to go with the ghetto way of doing things. I'm just going to glue in 2 pieces of 10-cent Canadian coins to make sure that the ball bearings that I'm going to be putting inside will have something to bounce off and causing all kinds of horrible commotion that hopefully the fish will find irresistible. So I'm just going to glue these 2 coins inside with 5-minute epoxy. You know, this might be hard to believe, but in all of my years that I've made lures, which is roughly about 25 years or so, I've never made a lure that has rattles inside of them. I don't know why, I just haven't. So I decided, you know what, it's about time I make one. And since I don't have any experience in these things, I need to test out what amount of ball bearing sounds the best. And fun fact, these actually come from a sliding drawer mechanism that I just took apart and took the ball bearings. And in the end, I opted to go with 4 of them in total. Alright, next I'm going to glue the 2 halves together. And this is kind of tricky because I have moving parts inside. So if you end up doing something similar to this, make sure that you don't put too much of the glue in around the rattle chamber so that the glue won't actually seep into it and bind into the ball bearings. Once the epoxy had cured enough, I headed back to the garage and to the drill press, and next I'm gonna drill a pilot hole for the eye sockets. And here you can get a pretty nice visuals on how dense and hard this wood actually is, because it smokes when I drill the hole. I noticed that there was a little bit of unevenness after the gluing, so I'm just going to smooth everything out with my disc sander next. So this lure is pretty flat by design, and because of that I don't actually have to take out too much material when I do the upper profiling. So I decided not to actually even do any kind of template to help me out with there. I'm just going to eyeball it. I mentioned earlier that this wood is pretty hard and dense, but also the grain doesn't go straight. It kind of bobs and weaves around those spots, which makes shaping this thing kind of a challenge, especially if I would use a knife here. So I decided, you know what, I'm not gonna have the headache of dealing with that, and I'm just gonna put the chamfers on with my disc sander instead. I finished off the chamfers with some 80 grit sandpaper and tried to make everything nice and smooth. Now that the lure is in a state where it's fairly smooth and rounded off to my liking, I'm just going to drill the eye sockets. And while I was at it, I decided, you know what, this is the perfect time to do the hook hangers and also the line tie. On a lipless crankbait, it's kind of a tricky thing to determine where to put the line tie into. So this is how I did mine. I'm just going to pinch it with my index finger and thumb and move myself backwards until I get the lure completely level. Alright, next I'm gonna glue in the hardware, aka the screw eyes. And the screw eyes that I've chosen for this project are pretty much musky grade, so I have no doubt in my mind that they will hold up to any kind of abuse that this lure would be put into. I'm just going to glue them in with 5-minute epoxy. Alright, before I can start painting this lure, I need to make sure that it's completely sealed. And I'm just going to use True Coat epoxy to do that. Before I can start doing any kind of painting, you know it, I have to choose some inspiring music to get me into the mood to paint some wicked things. And I don't think there's anything more wicked than Slayer's Hell Awaits. Alright, now that I have Tom Araya screaming in my ears, it's time to start painting. And I'm gonna start with black. And I wanted to make sure that we get to appreciate the beautiful texture of the lace wood, or leopard wood, whatever you want to call it. And so I'm just gonna do kind of a halvesies like I did with my previous project. So I asked you guys on my YouTube community feed what I should paint next for this project. And a lot of you guys said a perch. And I got to thinking, you know what? I've never actually painted a perch before. So yeah, let's do that. So in particular, we're going to be painting a yellow perch. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do the scales next. And in case you're wondering what I'm using here, this is called a tulle fabric, and it comes in several sizes. I actually don't remember what size this is. It's fairly small, and yeah, it's fairly readily available on the internet. You just type in tulle fabric and you should be able to find plenty of options out there. Next I'm going to add the background color for the head details, and I've chosen black. Yeah, you could probably use some other darker colors here. For example, maybe a deep shade of brown might be good. Probably some sort of green might be appropriate as well, especially if you would try to do some sort of perch pattern. But I've chosen black. Next I'm going to move on to the belly, and I'm just going to use white to give me a nice base to work with. And after that I'm just going to add some pearlescent colors into it. Now that the belly has some color, I can move on to the head details, and I'm going to be using this stencil to paint through and start with the mouth first. And this is the same exact gold that I used for the scales to make everything match together more nicely. And like always, I move backwards on the project and add the other head details and gill plate details and all the other things that make this thing come alive. And I'm still using the same exact gold. And yeah, I don't know if I really have that much to say about this, other than if you want to know and see how I make these templates, I have a separate video about that. And I think I will link that in the description box. Now that I'm pretty much done with the head details, I'm gonna move on to the back. And I've chosen this Russian green to do that. And this is kind of a appropriate color for the time. if you know what I mean. There's a lot of green Russians running around at the moment. But, you know, politics aside, I think this color actually suits really well with this paint job that I'm trying to achieve here. Next, we're gonna start painting the fins, and I'm gonna just lay out this orange on the base first, and then I'm going to paint the fin rays with black. After I was done painting the fin rays, I decided, you know what, since I still have this black paint inside of my airbrush, why don't I just go ahead and paint the stripes for my perch? And that is exactly what I did. Alright, so now that our perch is starting to look pretty good, I decided, you know what, I'm just gonna start adding some highlights on the head in certain areas. And I'm going to just start laying a background color of olive green. The North American yellow perch has these kind of blotches around its head and kind of on the back, or maybe even in the flanks a little bit. So I'm just going to add that next by using this sponge. I kind of like the rackety look of the perch bars, so I decided to accentuate those even further with a brush. So, unfortunately, I forgot to turn on the camera when I was doing these previous steps to get to this point as you're seeing right now. And I've added some color shift blue and also some color shift green. And now I'm putting some pink on the side of the gill plates to make them look a bit more fleshed out. And like always, one last thing to do before we are done is to add some ice into it. And I've already previously made these. I usually tend to do a bunch of them at a time, so I always have some leftovers, which is nice. And I'm just gonna glue them in with 5-minute epoxy. Alright, now that the lure is pretty much done, I just need to make sure that the beautiful paint job is protected, and I'm just going to epoxy it with True Coat epoxy. And I ended up adding 3 layers of epoxy, so in total this one has 5 layers of epoxy. So hopefully that should be enough to protect the lure from any kind of damage. And here is the final glamour shots of the lure after the epoxy had cured. And I have to say I'm fairly happy with how this thing turned out in the end. And lastly, we're gonna do the traditional swim test. And I gotta say, this tub is not the ideal place to do this, because I feel like this needs a little bit more space to get the full action. But I have to make do with what I got at the moment, and everything is still frozen where I'm at, so I can't actually go out there and test it in open water, unfortunately. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you didn't, my name is Vladimir Putler, and see you guys on the next video. I kind of have a really good idea of what I'm gonna do next. Hopefully, it will turn out good, but we'll see. Anyways, I'm out of here. See you guys on the next one.